later. And so over the last 2 years, we have done a lot of work to prepare for the moment that we've finally reached today. We've launched new content formats. We've adopted a bolder editorial voice. We've recruited new staff, established a whole range of procedures, as you can imagine, created a board of directors with whom you are in their presence today, and created a new investigative reporting unit that, as I say, Ben will speak to. Perhaps most importantly, we've had to fundraise from scratch, and that, as you can imagine, has been quite a challenge. We chose Geneva as our new headquarters because it is a global hub for humanitarian action and debate. It has already, in our short time here, given us many opportunities for new partnerships, but also for enhanced reporting streams, including aid policy and humanitarian financing. We have received great support from the government here, both at the Confederation level and at the Canton de Genève level, and we are very grateful for that. We would not have been able to be here today had it not been for that support. This spin-off is not without risks. We are in a very difficult media market, as you will know. Both commercial and non-profit media are closing down by the day because it is so difficult to find a sustainable business model for this kind of work. And our work in particular, is very expensive. We are producing original content from far-flung places of the earth. We exist thanks to grants from donors. We currently have funding from the Swiss Confederation, from the Swedish government, from the Swiss Lottery, and from a couple foundations, but we are seeking new and other funding partners in order to be able to continue our important work. So I will leave it at that for now and look forward to your questions later. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce the president of our new board of directors, Mr. Howard French, to my left and your right. Howard is a household name, and I'm sure all of you already know him. He's a former New York Times foreign correspondent, has traveled to 100 countries on 5 continents over his career with the New York Times. He has twice been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and is now an author and a professor of journalism at Columbia University in New York. We were very humbled that Howard agreed to be the president of our board, and I will hand over to him now for a few thoughts on the state of journalism today.
It's okay, you can.
Thank you very much, Heba. Is the sound okay?
Yeah. Just push the button now. Okay.
Okay. I was very grateful to have been invited a bit more than a year ago to join the board of IRIN as it was negotiating its relaunch, and then subsequently to be asked to be the president of the board, which is the capacity in which I appeared before you today. And I just wanted to speak for a couple of minutes about why I did so and what this role means to me, as we think about the kind of role that IRIN can play in the world of global media. I, as Heba said in introducing me, worked for the New York Times for a very long time, over 20 years as a foreign correspondent for that newspaper. And by coincidence, I'm presently writing a memoir of that portion of my career. And one of the things that this has forced me to do is to think carefully about the changing nature of the economics of the news business, internationally speaking, or generally speaking, as well as in particular as regards my own country. I had the fortune of working for a grand news organization with, as I think back on the heyday of my time overseas, with quite extravagant means for covering whatever it decided it wanted to cover. But as I've thought about the sort of evolution of my time as a newspaper reporter, focusing on international news and very typically working in the third world, so-called third world, and very often places in crisis or where there are humanitarian disasters, in the early half of my career, not only great or grand news organizations like the New York Times had foreign staffs and had the ability to cover humanitarian and other sorts of crises widely around the world. But even many less grand news organizations in my country and elsewhere in the world did so routinely as well. I think back to my very earliest days as a freelancer, selling articles from Africa, from West Africa mostly, but also other parts of Africa, to a number of secondary markets in the United States where newspapers in cities like Houston or Baltimore or Denver or Boston or Miami, far smaller cities than New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles, the three biggest media markets in the United States, all maintained really ambitious global news coverage. That's gone now. That doesn't exist anymore. These sorts of publications in the American market, and I think the American market is a good surrogate for what we've seen in many other regions of the world, including most of Europe, has consolidated to the point where there are very few newspapers that really seek in an ongoing way with a great deal of ambition to truly cover the world. The other thing I would like to say is that I've worked in lots of different regions of the world. Heba used this kind of embarrassing number that I've been to more than 100 countries, but a disproportionate amount of my career has been spent in Africa, a part of the world that I continue to travel to write upon, to write about, to think about, to be engaged with. And Africa today, and indeed always, has presented a very special challenge in regards to the deployment of resources and the devotion of what I like to call bandwidth from the international media in terms of really trying to come to grips with what's happening in a continuous way as opposed to just at the odd spike of crisis in country X, Y, or Z. Even in the heyday that I spoke about, where all of these secondary American newspapers and many analogous European publications sought to cover the world with ambition, Africa was treated substantially differently. In other words, one would tend to find that most publications had a correspondent for Africa if they had any African coverage, if they had any ongoing African coverage. Or in the case of what I've fancied as the grand publications, the New York Timeses and the Washington Post, a bureau or two around Africa. This was called Covering Africa, a country that is as big as, I don't need to actually break it down for a sophisticated audience like this. When you think of the geographic extent of Africa, it's the idea that one or two or three people in some cardinal points around the continent could really cover Africa is ridiculous. And so when I was invited to serve in this role with IRIN, it was because I understood a couple of really important things to me. One of them has to do with this longer term history of downsizing and consolidation and disengagement of media with international coverage outside of moments of acute crisis. And then two, most specifically, because I know that Africa has historically, even in times of prosperous, high profit media environments, always suffered as a kind of neglected afterthought. And if you look, was there a graphic in this presentation that showed, so in some of our materials, we have a very striking graphic which shows just, I think, in the last year where IRIN stories have come from. And IRIN stories come disproportionately from Africa, all over Africa, spread very widely. And it's done, the graphic is done very effectively. I'm sorry it wasn't up here, but you know, the continent is filled in with black dots, each black dot representing a place where an IRIN byline has come from. And this struck me as perhaps the most important representation of what IRIN is doing today that I can think of. IRIN is not just sprinkling the world with content from obscure African markets or African markets that would remain obscure because of the the historical problems that I've spoken about in terms of how Africa is treated by the world media, and the more recent problems that have to do with the consolidation of the news industry. But IRIN is doing something that takes things a further step, and that is it has invested in relationships with people on the ground in a wide and growing variety of African countries where we don't get a kind of parachute product where we're responding always in a catch-up mode to try to figure out what's happening, and we end up producing something that is a kind of crude summarization, an after-the-fact kind of quick attempt to gather the names of the most obvious suspects and try to make sense of the day's news. IRIN, that's not IRIN's model. IRIN's model is identifying people who know the terrain, who are invested in particular places, who have spent time on the ground, and who we expect will continue to spend time on the ground, with the result that they can produce a product that differentiates itself from the sorts of coverage of Africa that we have historically seen. I'm focusing on Africa not because IRIN only does Africa, but because Africa presents very particular problems, both in terms of the economics and ideology, even if you will, of the international news industry, but also because Africa itself factually does produce a disproportionate number of humanitarian situations. And so I'm very happy to be with you here today. I'm very happy to associate myself with this team. I think IRIN is really producing or providing an invaluable service. I look forward to helping build out the team together and to try to generate the kinds of resources that can allow us to continue to take steps to fill in these voids that we're speaking of. And I thank you all for coming today to have shared these thoughts with us and to have participated in this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. I will hand over now to Peter Buchardt to my right, who is another member of our board of directors. You'll also know of Peter, I'm sure, who is a celebrity online and was recently named one of Time's most influential people. Peter is a former war crimes investigator in The Hague. He is now the emergencies director at Human Rights Watch, and I've asked him to give us a bit more of the humanitarian crisis perspective, complementing what Howard has just outlined on the journalism side. So over to you, Peter. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I've worked for Human Rights Watch on the front lines of crises around the world for 20 years, and I think it's clear that we're going through one of the most difficult times the world has seen since the end of World War II on a global scale. We see the devastating conflicts in the Middle East, from Syria to Yemen to Libya, the war in South Sudan, which is now turning from not just targeting its own people, but also targeting the UN peacekeepers and the humanitarians who are trying to save lives. And to the increasing tensions between Russia and China and the West, which are probably at the highest level they have been in decades. Just to give you one broad example of the scale of the crisis we face today, in 2012 there were about 40 million refugees and displaced people around the world due to these conflicts. Last year they went up to 65 million. That's a 50% growth in just 4 years. And it's a burden that we're all faced with around the world. At the same time, in those 20 years, what I see is that it's become a lot more lonely profession to report on these conflicts around the world. Where once we would see people from news bureaus all around the world responding to crises, now we're often the only ones on the ground in places like South Sudan, or the Central African Republic. And this is why I support IRIN, because it's really important that we have objective and dignified reporting from these crises around the world, from humanitarian crises that affect millions of people's lives in places like Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, housing so many Somalis, which is now in the process of being shut down, because otherwise we would not receive any information from these places. IRIN has been a crucial source of information for me since I joined Human Rights Watch in 1997. But I think the new IRIN also adds an important new element to the work of this organization, and that is holding humanitarians and the United Nations itself accountable for its actions. You know, there's been many moments in the history of the UN where they did not do the right thing. The crisis in Sri Lanka a few years ago, where they stayed silent about the extent of the slaughter taking place in the Vani at the final stages of the war, is a fine example. And it's really important that we have an independent IRIN, which is independently funded, which can take an honest look at humanitarian and UN operations around the world and provide a critical reporting on some of those failures as well. You have the sexual scandal in the Central African Republic right now, where the UN is still failing to stop sexual abuse by its peacekeepers. So I think that the new IRIN, even though it will be a lot more challenging to get it funded independently, rather than relying on UN funding, is a much more important news organization than it was under the UN aegis. And it will be an exciting journey. And in this collapsing world news environment, I think it will play a very important role in bringing the voices of people who normally don't have a voice, their experiences in front of us. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And as he alluded to, we have just launched a new stream of investigative and enterprise reporting to be able to better hold to account the humanitarian sector. This is a major reason for which we spun off from the UN, in order to have that editorial independence and be able to more critically analyze the sector. And the head of that new unit is Ben Parker, to my far right. Ben is the co-founder of IRIN, so he is behind this whole concept going back 20 years. He has taken on many roles within IRIN, but also outside of IRIN, recently as spokesperson for the UN mission in Somalia and head of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Syria. And so has an extensive mix of both real humanitarian experience on the ground, but also a very long and rich history with IRIN. So I will hand over to Ben, who, by the way, led this whole spin-off process before handing the baton to me. Thank you very much for that. and is now, as you can imagine, a very fundamental part of the team.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the other speakers, and we remain very grateful to our board members for giving their time and their expertise and their experience to this venture. I think what we're trying to do with this new stream of work is to dig a bit deeper, to go a bit further, to be more ambitious in shining a light both on the causes of crises and the manner in which the world responds. There are very few industries of this scale. I'm calling it an industry, the aid business. There are very few industries of this scale who have no specialized media. That's a very strange and unique, complex system of vested interests and a small concentration of power in a few hands. So by that I mean a handful of donors and a handful of giant aid agencies tend to monopolize this $20 billion, and the level of scrutiny and transparency in their work is extremely low. It's a bit like reporting on, the Vatican. The only things I get from the chimney of the UN is usually papers being burnt. But it is very rewarding because these are life and death matters. This is public money. These are people who come before you claiming to be doing the right thing for the most vulnerable and needy in the world. And often they get away with a pretty poor job, a pretty low level of honesty about their successes and failures. And I think if the world's needs are growing, then we need public confidence in what works and what doesn't. I don't think the level of public discourse on aid and emergency relief can continue if the public is kept in the dark. Certainly in large parts of Europe, there's not only a rising xenophobia, but there's also a rising distrust in the operations of the international system and the NGOs. And we certainly intend to expose wrongdoing, and we also hope to occasionally reveal, the successes and best practice. And we put a very high value on transparency. Accountability then and highlighting and righting wrongs is the traditional agenda of investigative journalism. We include in that, I think, also things which not everything has to be a top secret leak, and it doesn't have to be, secret coded communication. Sometimes this stuff is lying around in plain sight and is just not looked at. So we decided to look at the contractors of the UN. And there's a lot of public data, but it is each year they produce a 500-page PDF, and they refuse to give it out as a spreadsheet. So you have to take that PDF, then you have to run it through some translation code thing, then you have to run the names against other lists. And sure enough, we found something. We found the fact that the UN in the Central African Republic has as its landlord a blood diamond company, which the UN has sanctioned. Now, this wasn't exclusive. This information was in the public domain, but stored in a manner which was deliberately obfuscated. They call this open washing, where you say you're giving out all your data and you're open and you're transparent, but in fact your data is so impossible to consume, it's actually another form of hiding the truth. So we look forward to more discoveries, both from individuals who care and from things left in the public domain but haven't been found. We also expect to be doing a significant amount of on-the-ground fieldwork and getting some dust on our boots. It is strange to be working on something where there is so little other journalistic endeavor. Sometimes we're finding things out and we're like, hasn't anybody seen this before? It's like, really? Is that how we work? We discovered that the European Union had doubled its humanitarian budget, and the new money is entirely related to controlling migration. This stuff is in the public domain, but it's not kind of looked at with the right lens. And I think the aid enterprise is particularly opaque and suffers from a terrible amount of jargon and confusion. So yeah, we look forward to leaks and drips and exposés, but we also look forward to seeing how the industry and how the situations both in the field and in these institutions evolve. And we will also look hard at those who cause humanitarian crisis, including political leaders in the global south and the north. We're looking at the Saudis' behavior in Yemen. We're looking at the corruption of the South Sudanese political leadership. We're looking at the weaknesses of the UN in the Central African Republic and the Kenyan response, as you saw, to al-Shabaab in Somalia. So it's certainly not, we are an open access enterprise. We don't have a particular target. We're not after anybody, but we do think that more openness and more truth can only be good. Thank you.
Great. So before we open it up to questions, et comme j'ai dit au début, on peut aussi répondre aux questions en français. I would like to remind you that our official opening of our Geneva office will be taking place this evening at 3 Rue de Varambé at 6 o'clock. If you are interested in attending, please speak to me afterwards, and we will be happy to welcome you there. We have quite a lineup of speakers and a reception to follow. You'll also be able to meet some of our journalists from the field who are doing the work that we've been describing over the last half an hour. So I will hand over to Guy. Thank you very much.
thanks. So thank you to everybody. So, no, I was very interested by your speech, Mr. French, because I think as a journalist, I am especially also shocked by the way of double standard media coverage of the conflicts in the world, because there are so many neglected conflicts who are not covered by media. For instance, we have in Aleppo, every bomb is just followed, and in Yemen, nothing, or in Africa, nothing, or in other parts. So, and I think that's the biggest challenge for us, for journalists, you know, to try to have a better balance, not balance, but a better, yes, coverage. I have no solution, but I hope IRIN will bring it, but yeah. So I don't know how to do, but yeah, maybe. Oh, yes, you don't. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great question. Heba, in her introductory remarks, spoke about the independence of IRIN properly as a matter of its independence from its founding mothership, the United Nations. But there's another kind of independence of IRIN that's very important in relation to your question, and that is that most global media historically has been Western media. That's changing a bit nowadays, but it still remains mostly Western media. Most global media finds its agenda set either consciously or unconsciously by the national security and economic priorities of the capital of the country in which that, from which that media grows out of. And so this is an area where IRIN's independence is another important fact. IRIN is not a national media at all. So the French media covers the French-speaking world for obvious reasons, but may also decide to cover certain parts of the Middle East more than others, not simply because there's a particular French connection historically, but because France is, for reasons that we understand, obsessed with migration issues and Islamicization, etc. The United States media has its own predilections, the British media its own predilections, on and on and on. The importance of having an independent actor like IRIN is that we don't need to be guided by all of the predictable reflexes that guide the major news organizations that grow out of the Western tradition. And we don't have unlimited resources, so we can't try to do everything and be all things to all people, but we can cover places. Heba and I have had a little funny back and forth about the best way to describe this. She often speaks of forgotten crises, and that's a phrase I don't particularly like, but the thought I agree with, that IRIN is not hindered by the obligation that flows from a national lens to cover the sort of predictable things that nation X, Y, or Z might ordinarily be sort of obsessed with, right? And that's why when you look at the map of the coverage that we didn't get to see, but that I referred to, that has this kind of spray of dots from all the places where IRIN has its has had stories from in the last year, you see places that, you know, a heavy representation of places that simply don't make it into Le Monde, or don't make it into the New York Times, or don't make it into the Swiss press or the German press, etc. And that is because we have our own, we as an organization have our own sense of what is important and what is newsy and what must be paid attention to. And having this type of independence, I think, is one of the greatest types of value that we're adding to the picture.
Maybe just to add, in terms of, first of all, the map that Howard keeps referring to is in your brochures, so you'll finally get to see it. But secondly, the other aspect of independence is that we're not tied to any commercial or advertising interests. And I think that also affords us a fair degree of freedom. You know, there's the motivation of national security and what's sexy and what's interesting for domestic public, but there's also the motivation of what makes money. And while we face our own constraints in terms of funding and financing this work, we don't have to submit ourselves to that pressure.
Hello, my name is Ben. I work for AFP. I know it's the least fun part of the conversation, but can you give us some indication as to why you're confident you'll succeed on the fundraising part where so many others have failed? I can think of a few examples in recent years. Something like Global Post comes to mind, where they're trying to redo the paradigm and the intentions are totally altruistic from the outset, but they struggle. And especially in your case, it's sort of an interesting irony because getting to some of these hard places often requires big humanitarian organizations, because getting your reporters there independently is enormously expensive and often impossible. So how does that dynamic play out? And then just very quickly, just on audience, I looked up the CAR story while you were talking, and it's incredibly interesting, and it was published on September 2nd, and I haven't heard about it yet, not that I'm a model of anything. But how are you going to, when you have these scoops, how are you going to drive attention to these extraordinary stories, which clearly this one is? Because so often these things just sail by. So what's your thought there?
Maybe I'll start and then others can jump in. On the first question of fundraising, yes, it's a bold endeavor, and we understand that it may well fail. But we're hopeful for a few reasons. I think the first is that we've seen a growth in the United States in support for nonprofit journalism. We haven't seen that translate yet at a large scale to the international scene, but I think that's the next step. So you'll see a number of outlets in the US like ProPublica or the Marshall Project that have succeeded in getting nonprofit grant funding for the work that they do, and we see ourselves as the international complement to that. Secondly, I think within the humanitarian sector itself, there is a recognition increasingly of the need for this kind of accountability and transparency. It is a major focus of discussions happening now at very high levels in the sector. Recently, the first ever World Humanitarian Summit was held in Istanbul, and one of the major takeaways from that summit was the importance of better putting affected people at the heart of humanitarian action, and a recognition by the sector that they had drifted away from the core mission that they set out to do and are trying now to kind of get back to that. And so IRIN fits into those goals and contributes to that. And I think we can find funding within those sophisticated actors in the system who want to hold themselves to account. And finally, donors, philanthropists, foundations are becoming more sophisticated every day. Problems around the world are no longer isolated. Things happening in Yemen now land on Europe's borders. And I think everyone understands increasingly that we all need, these issues are no longer someone else's problem. And so we feel strongly that over time, as we try to communicate the need for this kind of work, that those sophisticated donors kind of come to the fore. And it's kind of a matter of building that critical mass and making the case. I don't think we've done it very well in the past, as you alluded to in your second question. In terms of the audience, one last point on fundraising. Our model is not bringing people in from New York to the DRC at huge cost. So our model is a local model where these are citizens of those countries who are already on the ground. So we're not paying these through the roof. And I used to work for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I'm a journalist myself. And I know very well that model of the foreign teams with their bulletproof vests and their high security, et cetera. That's not how we work. So we have a much leaner and more efficient model of tapping into the talent and resources that are already present on the ground, which means our costs are much less. On audience, it is certainly a challenge, and it's an area that we haven't invested resources in historically in terms of marketing and visibility. We're trying to change that now. This is a first step in that direction. But we recognize that we're producing really high quality content that isn't being seen as nearly as many people, by as many people as it should. So our model moving forward, we hope, is to strike syndication partnerships with big media outlets, similar to the way ProPublica operates, where we would have an exclusive story partner with the New York Times or the Guardian and have that reach a wider audience. We already have a number of syndication partners, including the Guardian. The Los Angeles Times has just joined as a new partner, allafrica.com and others. And we're often cited and republished by mainstream media. So we see ourselves as something of a bridge between this sector and the outside world. But it's an area in which we intend to invest much more effort and resources in the coming years.
Thank you, Boris.
Boris Engelson, local freelancer. I have half a dozen questions, but only one requires a reply. So the first one is more a remark. It is not quite true that there is a lack of coverage of what you call suffering throughout the world. There are a lot of documentary films, and each year in Geneva there is a festival attracting 2,000 times more people than today in the room, since in the room we are 15, and out of the 15, 14 and a half are probably here by duty. So your analysis is half correct, but not entirely. There is also the issue, you know, the crisis of the media. The reason of the collapse of paper print and the reason of the collapse of press agency may not be quite the same. And I have never heard any analysis of the collapse of UPI and Reuters and the like. But this does not expect a reply instantly. You told us, you sound very, very competent and honest people. I say that not by irony. I really I came here, I was sure it would be total hypocrisy and nonsense, and I was impressed. That's why I like to push further one or two questions. First, you referred to Sri Lanka as one of the criminal silencers of the UN system, but there is worse than that. Congo, the bloodletting in Congo is orchestrated by someone who have been forced by all human rights agencies to revere Kagame, the hero of Africa. He was guest under the label of Hero of Africa by UN agencies. He is considered a war criminal by Cornelius Omaruga and Ronnie Broman. So these are have still much far-reaching implications. Silence is one thing, but having a war criminal as the new hero of the human rights system is something else. I will not tell you what is my feeling on Kagame, because I don't know what I would do in his place. I am just trying to show the complexity of the issue. And the last one, if you say that what you want to address, if not to fix, is the shrinking coverage of the world reality, to emphasize that what we call the international community may not really be the total international community, then why do you address that with tears and blood? Because the reality is not only crisis. If there is a lack, if there is a crisis of the media, it's not only when people are killed. It's about the whole aspect, precisely those which are addressed usually by documentary films, can be addressed. And I came a few minutes late, but your video was only on the suffering and tears and blood. And Mr. Ben Parker has made irony on the Vatican dimension of the UN. But tears have always been used by all kinds of Vaticans to get following and funding. So I feel a little bit uneasy because you are not the only one. Every day in this room and in any room of an international community in Geneva, we have this video or this photo or this press release. Each NGO uses that. So try to make a difference.
Thank you very much. You were very honest in saying that you had a lot of things to say, and it wasn't all questions that needed an immediate answer. So I'm going to do my best. First of all, film festivals are wonderful. I love them. I go to them, and they do draw more than people, many of them, than we have here. But they don't really do very much to address questions of timeliness and emergency response and accountability of the international system and corruption and the sorts of things that Ben alluded to, which we believe that a greater investigative attention to can help remedy. Film festivals are a venue for showing things that took often years to produce. And by that time, the people who are the crying images and the pictures that you talked about are dead or displaced permanently or raped or forcibly married or trafficked or whatever, right? And so we don't think that there's an analogy to be drawn between what we're offering and what the documentary film industry, however wonderful its products sometimes may be, represents. Secondly, you raised a really interesting question about business models. I teach at one of the great journalism schools of the world, Columbia University's journalism school, and all of this is not my specialty, but all of the great minds, quote unquote, at my school and at many other places like it, are wrestling with the question, still unresolved, of what are the successful business models of the future going to be like for the global media. These are not just questions that IRIN is wrestling with. This is questions that anyone who is in journalism in whatever capacity is wrestling with. And so we have some little answers or beginnings of an answer to how we think we can proceed, which I'm going to come to in a minute, but we don't have the pretension to sit here and tell you that we have figured out the big picture questions that are going to say, okay, print versus news wire, et cetera, how's it all going to shake out? That's beyond the scope of what we're here to really address today. On the third and final thing, let me just close that loop quickly, if I could. You know, we've spoken here and there in our comments. We've spoken here, and the cord here is very short, so it's a bit awkward. But we've spoken here and there in our various comments about our approach. Heba just addressed it with the last question from I believe the gentleman from AFP, was it? That we don't have a big financial footprint in the sense of sending in teams of foreigners from far away who can, you know, parachute in and get into print in a day or two of having arrived from London in the middle of Congo or wherever overnight. Well, that's not our approach. Our approach is having people who are invested in, if not simply people from the countries concerned, which is often the case, people who, if it's not the case, are invested in a long-term presence in the countries concerned. And this brings with it a special kind of consciousness and awareness of the realities of these countries, which we think helps differentiate ourselves quality and content-wise. This also gets back to the AFP gentleman's question. We think that quality will, over time, be a very strong selling point for us. I invite you to look at the coverage just the other day of the ongoing crisis in Ethiopia that IRIN produced. Terrific report. I've seen little scattered things here and there and various other sort of leading international media about Ethiopia, not very much. Here's a piece that really sort of brings it all together and makes completely coherent sense of this crisis in a pretty important country that's being generally neglected. And so that's what our model is about. On Congo and the United Nations, there's a personal irony here for me in that I covered the war in Congo that produced the millions of deaths that you are alluding to. I've written a great deal about Rwanda since then and about Rwanda's role in the Congo. Ben Parker is the head of our investigative team at IRIN. I'm not prescribing, I'm not assigning Ben any particular work here, but this is the sort of thing that we have the capacity to do because we're independent, to say, so why is it that the United Nations has taken this or that stand vis-a-vis a particular actor or a particular crisis or a particular leader? What is the mixture of interests that's at play here, and what are the implications of all of these things? That's what an investigative unit, which is so important to our future, can enable us to do. We've just begun down this path, And if with a little patience, I think we will be able to do things that will impress you.
Did you want to add to that? Okay. Are there other questions from the floor?
Oh yeah, merci. So, hello, I'm Riva Goga. I am a correspondent at the UN Nation for a Balkan media called Focus Media. And actually, I had a question concerning the fact that you are mentioning your quality and your independency as your first value and what you're bringing on. But most of your work will be shown or at least published in national medias. So is this somehow affecting your independency? Because even if you do a independent work, the places where your work will be published are national medias. So how do you manage this? Because they may be select, or for example, if you give them let's say an analysis or something, maybe it's not in their interest to publish it at the moment. So where is this work going to go, or is it going to go somewhere else? Or I don't know if it was clear enough. Or
Actually, working a lot in Africa and other parts of the world, I think one of the most interesting elements of IRIN's work is that it does get republished a lot in local media in most African countries because the content is offered free. And so it is a real important source of information for Africans about what's happening in the rest of their continent. Obviously, a newspaper in Uganda, for example, does not have the resources necessarily to send somebody to Somalia or to Kenya to report on the Somali crisis, but they do have the ability to republish IRIN materials, and they do so with an incredible frequency.
Perhaps just to clarify, when other media republish our work, they don't edit it. So they publish on the condition that they republish in the same state that it was produced by IRIN. So they have no influence over our editorial production or editorial judgment. That's done in-house, and those who republish are taking our independently produced material and then channeling it to a wider audience. And so our view is always the more people we can reach, the better. And if an independent piece by IRIN appears in a media, in your words, that is selective or biased, we're taking our analysis and our independent viewpoint to, we don't want to be communicating only to those who already agree with what we say. So I think that's only a positive. Yes.
Hi, I'm Preeti. I'm an independent journalist, but notably I write for Politico in Brussels. My question is, what has been your fundraising experience so far? And when you say you were raising money for investigative journalism, what has been your experience? The broader question is, why haven't we able to replicate what we've seen in the US in terms of the mushrooming, or let's say a lot of non-profit investigative outfits in the US, but not so much in other parts of the world, particularly in Switzerland, as opposed to, say, Germany and so on. So what's been your challenges and for raising resources for investigative journalism?
I think as Heba said at the beginning, we see a trend in the US that we hope to be at the vanguard of in Europe, that this is a recognized area of activity for philanthropy, and it's a public good, and we hope that to persuade donors of different varieties that this is something that delivers value and is appropriate for their portfolio of giving. There are units in the UK who do investigative journalism, and then they tend to co-publish. So the Bureau for Investigative Journalism in London then pitches the story to a mainstream publication. They simultaneously publish. These are some of the kind of partnerships that we are still on the early days of. In the UK, it's slightly difficult because you can't be news making is not a charitable activity under the law. So we found one of the reasons Switzerland was attractive to us is that within the Swiss law, the pursuit of journalism for the public good is a charitable venture. So yeah, we're here to build that market in a way, and show that this can be part of philanthropy in Switzerland and Europe as a whole.
That's one of the aspects that I've been involved with, is fundraising for IRIN. And I think there is quite a lot of interest from the donor community, because we have to remember that the humanitarian industry, the humanitarian sector, is now a $20 billion sector. And they want to see greater oversight and critical reporting on some of the successes and some of the shortcomings and failures of various humanitarian operations. They have very few sources aside from self-reported sources to independently analyze what is going well and what is going wrong in the world of humanitarianism. So they do see the value of this reporting.
I think, did you have a question as well? And then we can come to the gentleman behind you.
I had a couple of questions. My name is Paula Dupois-Lebias. I'm an independent journalist here. First of all, I just wanted to know what concretely you're working with in terms of your budget, the budget that you have now, that you've been able to secure from the various donors that you mentioned. And then secondly, I was wondering, as one of your board members is from Human Rights Watch, whether you are going to be relying or have been relying at all from contributions in terms of articles from aid workers who are on the ground?
Okay, so in terms of the budget, our budget this year is, we will likely end the year at around somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million. I can give you more specifics. US dollars, yeah. And that is for us really bare bones budget. We, at our heyday within the UN, we're operating at the maximum around $11 million a year. So we've shrunk down quite significantly in this period of transition, as it was quite a fast turnaround, and we were, as I said, fundraising from scratch. And so we're trying to then build that back up to healthier levels and hope to reach around the $5 million mark in the coming years. Vis-a-vis contributions, we have introduced, it was one of the new things we did following our spin-off, op-eds as a new format. So we do receive contributions from aid workers, from academics, from volunteers, from local humanitarians, from a whole range of voices. And we see that as perfectly fitting with our mandate to create debate and a forum where various parts of the humanitarian sector can exchange ideas. We are not a channel for promotional corporate advocacy. And so we have very strict guidelines around what kind of op-eds we seek. And we've gotten, as you can imagine, a lot of offerings that we have turned down because they simply don't fit our mandate. Our mandate is to improve humanitarian action through our journalism. And so we try to produce material that fits within that frame.
Simon Bradley, Swiss Info. You talked frequently about independence under the new spin-off setup. When you were working within the UN system, were you gagged? Have you been gagged in the past? And then a second question about the budget. In 2014, when you presented you were going to do the spin-off, we learned that Mr. Jolo was going to, he'd announced that you were going to get 25 million over a 15-year period. What's the status with that money and that whole episode?
So maybe I'll take the first and the second, sorry, and do you want to take the gagging question? Okay. So regarding our funding from Jolo, indeed, the Ginwell Foundation had pledged $25 million, in fact, in this room 2 years ago. And we did receive seed funding from the Ginwell Foundation to the tune of about $2 million, which was crucial in allowing us to spin off. We have no partnership with the Ginwell Foundation at this time. And so the rest of that pledge has not been given, and we have not sought it out.
In the light of the latest the ongoing investigation regarding the Malaysian money, was there a lack of due diligence, would you say, regarding that?
We did conduct due diligence before entering into a partnership with the Geneva Foundation, and this was quite long ago, and the facts on the ground were quite different than they are today. And as soon as we became aware of the extent of the situation, we changed the terms of our agreement with that foundation in particular.
I mean, regarding the UN allowed IRIN quite a surprising degree of editorial independence over the years, but I think it's true to say at the tail end that freedom was shrinking, and a number of hot issues made it harder and harder for the senior management of OCHA, the department under which it fell. It made it harder and harder for OCHA to protect and defend that space. And it's actually, in some ways, starting with Sri Lanka in 2009, a series of very sensitive international issues made OCHA lose the appetite, I think, for allowing IRIN a proper and full degree of editorial independence. But you'd have to ask them.
Yeah, I mean, I witnessed some of this as an outsider to IRIN. There certainly was a degree of uncomfortableness, gagging may be a strong word, but certainly some editorial interference when it came to Sri Lanka and some of the Syria reporting. I think at the same time, OCHA recognized that IRIN did need to grow, and that it was important for IRIN to have that independent voice outside the UN. So, you know, I think it's a process, a transformation that is largely supported by the UN and by OCHA to give IRIN a more independent voice.
Was there, just before I come back to you, in case there are others who haven't asked questions, was there a question at the back? If there are any other new voices, otherwise I think we'll take a last comment and then close there. Thank you.
I'll be much briefer. But first, isn't it a paradox that in a time when a man in the street, on the spot, with a mobile phone can cover a crisis, whereas 20 years back you needed to send a whole team across the world with heavy equipment, there is a crisis of coverage of all these crises? This is my first question.
Look, the man in the street with the phone cannot cover a complex crisis. And it's a mistake to think that the kind of experience that journalists bring to the coverage of a crisis and the independence, impartiality can be replaced by Twitter. And I think Twitter will be the first organization to realize that. You need people with experience, and you need boots on the ground, people who are willing to go to these places to report on them. And that's what we're losing in the world of journalism, and it's a gap IRIN and other organizations are trying to fill, so we can have an understanding of the complexities of the situation and not just kind of sensational journalism about Africans killing each other, which often dominates in the press.
That's why films are useful even when they come to...
There's no question that documentaries are useful. These are complementary sources of information.
And my second and last question, you referred to the crisis of confidence vis-à-vis the UN organizations. And it is true that me, as an accredited journalist, within the system, I would never suspect that people like you do exist. I thought that we only had robots and formatted people. Okay. So my question is, in the early years of the UN, this dichotomy, this schizophrenia was not so strong, but it was in the late period of the League of Nations. Does that mean that we are again in a context of the last years of the League of Nations?
Heber and I both left UN jobs to do this because the opportunity to do this independently was important to us professionally and personally. So we can only speak for ourselves. I think the UN can speak for the UN.
Thank you all for your patience, and we will be around later if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you.